The first thing she heard was the crying. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of sound that gets tangled up in the floorboards and lost in the hay, a tiny broken thing you could almost mistake for the wind. Miriam pushed open the heavy barn door, and the smell of damp earth and old memories hit her first. Then she saw him. A little boy, couldn't have been more than 6, was hunched in the corner of a horse stall. But he wasn't just in the stall. He was locked inside it. A thick, rusty iron lock was bolted across the wood, trapping him like an animal. His face was buried in his arms, his tiny shoulders shaking with sobs that had no sound left in them. When he heard her step, he lifted his head. The terror in his eyes was ancient, a fear that didn't belong on a child's face. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. She fell to her knees, her skirt sinking into the straw, her hand trembling as she reached through the slats. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're safe now." But her heart was a war drum in her chest, pounding with a fury so cold it burned. Who could do this? Who could cage a child? The boy's lips moved, but only a whisper of air came out. She leaned closer, her ear almost touching the splintered wood, and finally she heard it. "Mama left," he choked out. "They said I'm no good." The words were a knife in her gut. She'd known unkindness in her life, the sting of gossip and the chill of judgment, but she had never seen cruelty forged into iron and steel. Her fingers traced the cold, rough metal of the lock, and she knew she couldn't just walk away. This lock, this cage, this child, it was a wrongness she had to set right. Just then, a shadow fell across the doorway. Boots crunched on the dirt floor behind her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, and saw Caleb Rowe. He was a man who lived on the edge of town, in the edge of conversation, a cowboy with a scarred jaw and eyes that held the silence of the mountains. He stood there, the setting sun at his back, making him a dark, imposing silhouette. He didn't say a word. His gaze went from the lock, to the boy, to her. He was weighing the scene, weighing her, trying to figure out what she was going to do about this horror she'd stumbled upon. Miriam got to her feet slowly, brushing hay from her skirts. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she lifted her chin and spoke the simple, terrible truth. Someone locked him in here. They left him to cry in the dark. Caleb's eyes narrowed. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, like stones rolling downhill. But it held the weight of an oath. "Not anymore," he said. "Not if we take him out." The boy let out a tiny whimper, a sound caught between hope and fear. Caleb stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Miriam knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the moment she undid that lock, she wasn't just freeing a child, she was starting a war. And the whole town would be there to watch. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking as she worked at the rusty bolt. The iron was frigid, like it held all the coldness of the nights the boy had spent in here. With a final, jarring clatter, the lock came free. The stall door swung open, and the boy stumbled out, collapsing into her arms. He was so light, a bundle of bones in terror. She held him tight, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel herself, her eyes locked on Caleb. The cowboy stepped past them, picking up the heavy iron lock. He turned it over and over in his broad, calloused hand, his scarred jaw tightening with every passing second. He wasn't just looking at a piece of metal. He was memorizing the face of an enemy. But that's when they heard it. Voices from the yard. Men laughing, a woman's shrill tone cutting through the evening air. The barn door, which had swung halfway shut, was kicked wide open. Silas Turner stood there, framed in the doorway, a jug of whiskey dangling from one hand. His wife clung to his other arm, her face a mask of sour disapproval. Silas's eyes, blurry with drink, took a moment to focus. When they did, the laughter died on his lips, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. He was the boy's uncle. "What in the hell do you think you're doing with that whelp?" he snarled. His wife chimed in, her voice like nails on a slate. "He's a curse, that one. Born weak, not worth the food it takes to keep him breathing." Miriam rose from the floor, the boy still clutched in her arms like a shield. Her bonnet had fallen back, and her eyes, usually so mild, were blazing. No curse, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, could ever be an excuse for this. Silas lunged, his hand outstretched to snatch the boy away. But Caleb was faster. He moved like a shadow, planting himself between them. The heavy iron lock was still in his hand, and he let it swing slightly. A silent, damning piece of evidence. You locked him away. Caleb's voice was a low growl, cutting through the tense air of the barn. You treated him worse than your cattle. You will not touch him again. Silas's face turned a blotchy, furious red, but he hesitated. Even drunk, he recognized the danger in Caleb's stance. The quiet cowboy had a reputation. He kept to himself, but stories followed him like dust on the trail. Stories of a man you didn't cross. Still, pride was a powerful poison. He's my blood, Silas spat, his courage returning. My property. And no washed-up spinster and her broken-down ranch hand are going to tell me different. The insult struck Miriam like a physical blow, but she tightened her hold on the child. She could feel his tiny fingers digging into the fabric of her dress, and a fierce, protective instinct she'd never felt before surged through her. Words came out of her mouth that she hadn't planned, words that seemed to come from a deeper, wilder part of herself. Blood means nothing without love, she declared, her voice shaking but clear. He's mine now. Caleb's head turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. He saw the trembling defiance there, the raw, unshakable truth of her claim. And for the first time, a flicker of something other than hardness entered his voice. It was still deep, still rumbling like distant thunder. But it was different. She's not alone, he said, his gaze returning to Silas. If she stays, we'll both raise him. The barn went dead silent. The only sound was the rustle of straw and the boy's ragged breathing. It was a vow, spoken in a dusty barn over a discarded lock, but it was heavier than any promise made in a church. Silas stared at them, his mouth working silently, before he let out a string of curses. He turned and stormed out into the fading light, his wife scrambling after him. The whole town will hear about this, he roared over his shoulder. You'll be a disgrace by sundown. By the next morning, he had made good on his promise. The town wasn't just buzzing, it was humming like a disturbed beehive. Whispers followed Miriam down the main street, curling like smoke from the porch of the mercantile, the saloon, even the steps of the church where she had always been welcomed with quiet respect. Now heads turned for a different reason. Eyes narrowed. People looked at the woman who dared to walk through town with another family's shame clinging to her skirts. The boy, whose name they learned was Thomas, held her hand tightly, his small face pale. Caleb walked on her other side, a silent, formidable guardian. His broad shoulders and the grim set of his jaw were enough to keep the whispers from becoming outright insults, but the stares were like hot coals on Miriam's skin. A cluster of women outside the general store didn't bother to lower their voices. Lost her senses, one of them muttered, loud enough to be a proclamation. Tying herself to a cursed child like that. Another one hissed, she's just desperate, trying to catch the eye of that cowboy, the only man who'd looked twice at her. Miriam's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she kept walking, each step a silent act of defiance. She would not let them see her break. She would not let their poison touch the little boy who had already known too much of it. Inside the store, the storekeeper, a man she'd known her whole life, looked at Thomas as if he were a stray dog she dragged in. You planning on paying for his keep with what your mother left you? He asked, his voice oily with false concern. Or is the cowboy footing the bill? He made it sound like the boy's life was an entry in a ledger, a debt to be tallied. Before Miriam could answer, Caleb stepped forward. He placed a stack of coins on the counter with a thud that echoed in the silent store. His voice was dangerously quiet. You will never, he said, leaning in, speak of this child as a debt again. The storekeeper paled and stammered an apology. Thomas looked up at Caleb, his eyes wide with a kind of awe. He was seeing for the first time what it was like to be defended. As they stepped back out onto the sun-drenched street, a new figure appeared. It was Miriam's father. He stood at the far end of the boardwalk, his face a thundercloud. His voice boomed across the street, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Miriam, You have shamed this family. No daughter of mine will throw her life away on a nameless orphan and a man who has more scars than honor." Thomas flinched, burying his face in Miriam's dress. The old familiar fear of her father's anger rose in Miriam's throat, threatening to choke her. She felt herself shrinking, the defiant woman from the barn vanishing, replaced by the timid daughter she had always been. But before she could falter, before she could utter a single word, Caleb moved. He stepped directly in front of her, placing himself between her and her father, a solid wall of resolve. His voice was steady, unyielding, and carried to every corner of the street. "You don't get to decide her worth," Caleb said, his eyes locking with her father's. "And you sure as hell don't get to decide his." The crowd went completely still. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the explosion, and Miriam's heart hammered against her ribs because she knew. What started in a locked stall was now a fire spreading through her entire life, and it was daring them all to stand firm or be burned to ash. That night, Thomas wouldn't sleep. Every time his eyes started to close, they would snap open again, wide with a lingering terror. The firelight flickered on the cabin walls, and every creak of the old wood made him jump, as if he expected the barn door to slam shut on him again. Miriam sat on the edge of his small cot, humming a lullaby she barely remembered, her fingers gently trying to smooth the tangles in his hair. But his small hands were clenched in the blanket, his knuckles white. He was a prisoner still, even in this warm, safe room. Caleb had been sitting silently in the corner, watching them. He got up, went to his saddlebag, and pulled something out. It was the heavy iron lock from the barn. He walked over to the small table in the center of the room and set it down. The firelight glinted off its cold, dark surface. Miriam stared at it, a fresh wave of anger washing over her. "Get that thing out of here," she whispered fiercely. "He shouldn't have to see it." But Caleb shook his head. His expression was serious, thoughtful. "He has to," he said, his voice low. "He needs to see that it's just a piece of iron now. It's not a monster. It has no power over him anymore." Thomas's eyes, wide and fearful, darted to the lock. His breathing grew shallow, quick. Caleb picked up the lock, along with the key he'd used to open it. He rattled the key in the lock, a small metallic sound in the quiet cabin. Then he knelt down beside the cot. He didn't say anything at first. He just held the lock in his open palm, showing it to the boy. "Men make these," Caleb said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But men can also break them. A lock is only as strong as the will of the person who refuses to be chained by it." He took Thomas's small, trembling hand and placed the lock and key into it. The weight of it seemed to surprise the boy. Miriam watched, tears stinging her eyes. She had seen the hard, unyielding side of this scarred cowboy. She never imagined he had this kind of quiet wisdom in him. Thomas stared at the lock in his hand. He turned it over, his little fingers tracing its rough edges. Then, in a voice so small it was barely a breath, he whispered, "It can't hurt me anymore." Caleb's hand rested on the boy's shoulder. His voice was firm, a solemn promise. "Not while I'm here. Not while she's here." Miriam reached out, her hand covering both the boy's and Caleb's. The key was cool against her skin, and for the first time since she'd found him in the straw, she saw a flicker of something new in Thomas's eyes. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the seed of trust, fragile and precious. The lock, which had been a symbol of such cruelty, was transformed in that moment. It was no longer a cage, it was a trophy. It was proof of what they had overcome. As Thomas's eyelids finally grew heavy and drifted shut, his fist still loosely curled around the key, Miriam looked across the fire at Caleb. She saw more than just the man who had faced down her father. She saw the man who had found the right words to begin healing a shattered little boy. His earlier promise echoed in her mind. If she stays, we'll both raise him. She realized her choice was no longer just about protecting Thomas. It was about whether she could let herself trust this man, this stranger whose unexpected strength made her believe the impossible might just be possible. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the rumors and judgments of the town. But inside the cabin, there was a fragile peace, forged around a rusty iron lock that served as a constant, silent reminder of the fight that was still to come. By dawn, the fragile peace was shattered. Thomas's whimpers had turned into the harsh, rasping coughs of a serious illness. Miriam pressed her hand to his forehead, and his skin was burning hot. His breaths were shallow, rattling in his small chest. Her heart clenched with a new kind of fear, a fear that felt colder and sharper than Silas's anger. The lock and key sat on the table, mocking her with their uselessness. What good was freedom if she couldn't keep him alive? She felt a terrible, creeping dread that all her defiance had done was give him one warm night before he was taken from her anyway. Caleb was a whirlwind of controlled energy. He moved with a grim purpose, fetching fresh water from the creek, splitting kindling with sharp, angry blows of his axe. Every cough from the cot seemed to tighten the muscles in his jaw. "Ride for the doctor," Miriam begged, her voice frantic. "Please, Caleb." He stopped, his face grim in the gray morning light. "And tell him what?" he said, his voice rough with worry. "That we need help for a boy his family threw away? The boy Silas Turner calls a curse? No doctor in this town will risk angering Silas to help us, Miriam. We're on our own." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Rage and a gut-wrenching helplessness churned inside her. She slammed her fist on the table, and the iron lock rattled, a cruel metallic laugh. "We can't lose him," she cried, her voice breaking. "We fought for him. We can't let him just slip away." In two long strides, Caleb was across the room. He took her hand, his own rough and calloused but surprisingly gentle. "He won't," he said, his voice low and intense. "Not while we're still breathing." He then did something that surprised her. He went to his saddlebag, the one he guarded so carefully, and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He emptied the contents into his scarred palm, a collection of dried herbs, gnarled roots, and what looked like crushed flowers. The medicine of a man who had learned to survive alone in harsh places. He brewed a dark, bitter-smelling tea. Getting Thomas to drink it was a battle. Miriam held the boy upright, his small body limp against her, whispering prayers and encouragement. With every tiny choked sip, Caleb managed to get into him. The hours dragged on. The fever was a relentless fire, and Thomas began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering despite the blankets piled on top of him. Miriam finally broke. The fear and exhaustion overwhelmed her. Sobs racked her body. "Maybe they're right," she confessed to Caleb, her voice thick with tears. "Maybe he is cursed. Maybe God himself marked him for this. And no matter what we do, fate will just drag him back into the darkness." Caleb, who had been bathing the boy's forehead with a cool cloth, looked up at her. His eyes were burning with a fierce, almost feral intensity. "Then I'll fight fate," he said, his voice like steel. "I've wrestled blizzards and rock slides. I've faced down things that would make a preacher lose his faith. I will not bury this child, Miriam. Not now. Not ever." His vow was like a thunderclap in the small cabin. It didn't banish her fear, but it gave her something to hold on to. She clung to his words as fiercely as Thomas was clinging to the tattered edge of his blanket. They fought through the long, merciless night together. Just as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, the fever broke. Sweat beaded on Thomas's forehead, and his ragged breathing finally softened, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. Miriam wept, but this time the tears were of pure, unadulterated relief. They fell onto her hands, onto the key that Thomas still held loosely in his fist. Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of shared victory and quiet understanding. But his touch also carried a warning. The fever was gone. But out there, beyond the cabin door, the town's judgment was still waiting, a storm cloud ready to burst. They both knew the fight for Thomas was far from over. The boy had only just woken up, his eyes clear but his body still weak, when a thunderous pounding rattled the cabin door. Each blow was sharp and violent, like someone was trying to break the wood down. Miriam jumped, instinctively pulling Thomas closer to her, while Caleb rose from his chair. There was no panic in his movements, only a grim, calm precision. He slid the heavy iron bar from the door and pulled it open. Silas Turner stood on the porch, and he wasn't alone. He had half a dozen townsmen with him, their faces set in grim, self-righteous lines. Behind them all, Silas's wife watched, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. "You stole my blood!" Silas bellowed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Thomas. "The law says he belongs to me." A murmur of agreement went through the men with him. They shuffled their feet and avoided looking directly at Caleb, but their support for Silas was clear. Caleb's silence seemed to unnerve them more than any shouted threat could. Miriam stepped forward, her body shielding Thomas from their hostile glares. "You have no right to him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You forfeited that right when you put a lock on his door." The crowd shifted. It was one thing to gossip about cruelty. It was another to have it laid bare in the clear light of day. A few of the men looked uncomfortable, but Silas just sneered. "You're just a desperate, meddling spinster," he spat, "trying to trap a man by pretending to be a mother." The insult was meant to shame her into silence, and for a second it almost worked. Heat flooded her cheeks. But before she could retreat, Caleb stepped out onto the porch. The iron lock from the barn was dangling from his fingers. He held it up high so everyone could see it, the key glinting in the morning sun. His voice wasn't a shout, but it thundered across the yard, reaching every man there. "This is what Silas Turner calls family," he declared. "Iron and straw and a little boy's tears. If that's what kinship means to him, he can have it, because this boy is ours now." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Silas, enraged, lunged forward, trying to push past Caleb and get into the cabin. But Caleb's arm, scarred and hard as oak, shot out and slammed Silas back against a porch post. The entire structure shuddered from the impact. "You want to take him?" Caleb growled, his voice a low, deadly threat. "You'll have to come through both of us, and you're gonna need more men." A thick, heavy silence fell over the yard. The only sound was Thomas's small, weak cough from inside. Miriam lifted her chin, her hands trembling but her resolve like iron. "You call him cursed," she said, her voice ringing out. "You call him unwanted. We call him son." The word hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. It was a spark landing in dry grass. Silas cursed them, his face purple with rage, but something had shifted. Some of the men with him dropped their eyes, shuffling their feet again. They had come for a confrontation, but they hadn't bargained on this. They hadn't bargained on the lock, on Caleb's raw strength, or on the fierce love in a woman's eyes. Silas, seeing his support crumble, spat on the ground. He shot them one last look of pure hatred and stormed off, his posse trailing uncertainly behind him. They left behind not violence, but a silence that was somehow heavier, more foreboding. The town hadn't been won over. It had just been forced to take a step back. Miriam sank onto a chair, her heart hammering, the weak but living child in her lap. Caleb stepped back inside and set the lock on the table with a deliberate, forceful thud. It was a statement, a flag being planted. His jaw was tight as he looked at her. "They'll be back," he said grimly, "and next time they won't bring words." Night fell like a shroud over the small valley. The fire in the hearth cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to whisper the threats Silas had left behind. Miriam sat in the rocking chair, Thomas finally asleep in her arms, his breathing slow and even. She stared into the flames, trying to find a courage there that she didn't feel in her own heart. Caleb moved around the small cabin with a quiet, restless energy. He checked the bolt on the door. He inspected the shutters on the windows. He leaned his rifle against the wall, within easy reach. The air between them was thick with unspoken fear. Finally, he came and knelt by her chair. His scarred hand rested gently on the blanket covering Thomas. His voice was low, steady as the earth beneath them. "They'll come again, Miriam. We both know it. But this cabin, this family we're making, it won't break. Not as long as I'm here." She looked at him, really looked at him then. Her heart ached with a confusing mix of terror and a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical weight. No one had ever stood for her like this. Not her father, not anyone. He wasn't fighting for her affection or for any reward. He was fighting because it was the right thing to do. Tears welled in her eyes. "What if they win, Caleb?" she whispered, the question that had been haunting her. "What if they just take him? What if they tear it all down before we've even had a chance to build it?" He leaned a little closer. The firelight carved deep shadows and bright highlights on his rugged face. There was no doubt, no hesitation in his eyes. "Then they'll have to tear me down first," he said simply. "And I don't fall easy." The words were like a steel rod being driven into the ground, solid and unshakable. But beneath the raw strength, she heard something else, a promise that went deeper than just protection. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing against his wrist, feeling the coiled strength there. For the first time in her adult life, she let herself lean on someone else's certainty. Just then, Thomas stirred in his sleep. His small hand came out from under the blanket and rested on Caleb's sleeve, as if he were sealing the pact himself. Caleb's eyes met hers over the sleeping child's head. In their depths, she saw the shadows of his past, the scars he carried on the inside. But she also saw an unflinching resolve that mirrored her own. Something shifted in the quiet cabin, a fragile bond, forged not in courtship or sweet words, but in shared danger and a desperate need to protect an innocent life. "We'll both raise him," Caleb said again, his voice soft, repeating the vow he'd made in the barn. "Not because some accident of fate left him on our doorstep, but because he's ours now." Miriam's throat tightened. The tears she'd been holding back finally fell, tracing paths down her cheeks. She nodded, pressing her face into Thomas's soft hair. "Then we'll have to be enough," she whispered. "For him, and maybe for each other." Outside, the wind howled, clawing at the cabin like a hungry animal. But inside, the fire burned bright, and three lonely souls huddled together, bound by a promise made in the face of a gathering storm. They all knew it was only a matter of time before the storm broke. Sunday dawned cold and clear. The stillness in the air felt heavy, unnatural. Miriam dressed Thomas in his best mended shirt, smoothing the collar with hands that shook slightly. It felt like she was dressing a little soldier for battle. Caleb saddled his horse, his movements economical and precise, his jaw set like granite. He knew what was waiting for them. The churchyard was where the town rendered its final verdict, and the whispers there could cut deeper than any knife. As they approached, the quiet chatter of the townsfolk died out. Heads turned in unison, a silent, coordinated wave of judgment. A silence fell over the churchyard, heavier than any prayer. Silas was already there, positioned strategically near the church steps. He had his hat tipped low, but his voice was pitched to carry. "That child ain't hers," he announced to the crowd, "and he sure ain't his. You all know it. There was a reason he was locked away. And now these two parade him around like he's some kind of prize." The crowd shuffled uncomfortably. Men crossed their arms. Women whispered behind their hands. Miriam could feel Thomas pressing against her leg, his small hand clutching her skirt. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and refused to look away from their stares. Caleb took a half step forward, his fists clenched at his sides, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Miriam put a hand on his arm. "Not with anger," she whispered, her voice firm. "With the truth." He stopped, his body rigid with tension, and watched as she walked past him, leading Thomas by the hand, and mounted the church steps. She turned to face the entire congregation. Her voice when she spoke was shockingly clear and steady. "He's right," she said, and a murmur went through the crowd. "We did find him locked in a barn, treated like an animal, and yes, we chose to free him. If that makes us outcasts in your eyes, then so be it. But I want you all to know this. When I see a child suffering, I will not turn my back. I will not walk away." A new ripple of whispers went through the yard. Some of the women clutched their own children a little tighter. A few of the old men looked thoughtful. But Silas just sneered and spat into the dust. "He'll bring a curse on you, woman, just like his kind brought a curse on their own blood." Miriam's face flushed with anger. But before she could respond, a small, piping voice cut through the tension. It was Thomas. He had stepped forward, away from the safety of her skirts, and was looking directly at Silas. "She's my mama now," he said. The simple words, spoken with the unshakable conviction of a child, landed like a physical blow. The entire churchyard went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Gasps were audible. A few people nodded slowly, unable to deny the raw power of what they had just witnessed. Caleb moved to stand behind them, a silent mountain of support. his presence a shield against the venom twisting on Silas's face. Just then, the church doors opened. The preacher, a gray-haired man with weary eyes, stood on the threshold. He raised a hand for silence. "The good book tells us to shelter the orphan," he said, his voice old but strong. "Not to cast him out. You can judge these people as you will, but this house of God will not close its doors to that child." Silas let out a string of muttered curses and shoved his way through the crowd, storming off in a fury. But the damage was done. The town was no longer a unified wall of disapproval. It was fractured. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Some now whispered prayers for the strange new family, while others honed their hatred, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. As the first hymn began inside the church, Miriam's voice was shaky, but she sang. Thomas held her hand, and Caleb stood beside them, solid and unmovable, knowing that the real storm had nothing to do with heaven. It was coming from the hardened hearts of the people they had to live among. The smell hit them first. Sharp, acrid smoke, seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls, biting at the back of their throats. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hand before his eyes were fully open. Miriam grabbed Thomas, her heart seizing with a sudden, terrible premonition as an unnatural orange glow began to flicker and dance across the room. "The barn," Caleb growled, and he was through the door and into the night before the word was even finished. Miriam ran after him, her nightgown tangling around her legs, the frigid night air stealing her breath. The barn was an inferno. Flames licked up the old dry timbers, clawing at the night sky like a monstrous fiery beast. Sparks and embers rained down, painting streaks of orange against the suffocating blackness. And then, from inside the roaring blaze, came a thin, terrified scream. It was Thomas. He must have woken up and slipped out, maybe looking for the tattered blanket he'd had in the stall, the only familiar thing from his old life. "Mama!" His cry was shredded by the roar of the fire, but it tore through Miriam's heart. She lunged forward, blind with panic, but Caleb's arm shot out, catching her. His grip was like iron. "No, stay here! I'll get him!" he yelled over the noise. He ripped a piece of cloth from a nearby rain barrel, soaked it, and tied it around his face. Then, without another moment of hesitation, he charged headlong into the burning doorway and was swallowed by the thick black smoke. The world seemed to stop. Time stretched and warped. Every crackle of a collapsing beam was a hammer blow against Miriam's chest. She fell to her knees in the dirt, her hands clasped together so tightly her nails dug into her palms, praying aloud, the words a desperate, incoherent babble. Then a shape emerged from the wall of flame. It was Caleb. He was staggering, bent over, coughing violently. But cradled against his chest, wrapped in his smoldering coat, was Thomas. Miriam scrambled to her feet and ran to them. She snatched the boy from his arms, wrapping him in her own shawl, covering his soot-streaked face with frantic, tearful kisses. Caleb collapsed to the ground, his body racked with deep, agonizing coughs, his eyes streaming from the smoke. Miriam knelt beside him, her tears falling on the scorched sleeve of his shirt as she gripped his arm. That's when she heard it, a laugh, a cold, mocking laugh that cut through the night. From the shadows just beyond the reach of the firelight, 3 figures emerged. It was Silas and 2 of his cronies. Their faces were illuminated by the hellish glow of the fire they had set. "You can't keep him!" Silas shouted, his voice triumphant and cruel. "The town won't stand for it. He belongs in the dirt." Caleb pushed himself up onto one knee. He was unsteady, his lungs screaming for air, but he managed to raise his rifle. His voice was a ragged, smoke-choked rasp, but it was filled with pure, unadulterated steel. "Then let the town watch me stand," he wheezed. The fire roared, a towering pillar of destruction, casting their long, defiant shadows against the darkness. Miriam held Thomas, her heart a frantic drum, and she knew. This was the turning point. This was no longer about saving one lost little boy. It was about choosing love in the face of hate, family in the face of shame. Tonight, here in the ashes of their barn, their war would be won or lost. By dawn, the barn was a skeleton of blackened, smoking timbers. The air smelled of ash and defeat. But the real fight wasn't in the ruins. It was in the town square. Word of the fire and of Caleb's heroic rescue had spread like wildfire itself. By mid-morning it seemed the entire town had gathered. Men stood with their arms crossed, their faces unreadable. Women whispered nervously to each other. Silas Turner stood in the center of it all, bold and arrogant. He thought the fire had proven his point. "That boy is a curse," he proclaimed, his voice ringing through the silent square. "He brings ruin wherever he goes. He's my blood, and the law says I get to decide his fate. No field widow and her drifter bodyguard are going to change that." He sneered at Caleb, who stood beside his horse, his coat still singed, his face grim. Thomas was there, holding tight to Caleb's hand, a small, brave figure wrapped in one of Miriam's shawls. For the first time there was no fear in the boy's eyes, only a quiet trust. Caleb's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. It was low, but every person there heard every word. "The law is written in books, Silas," he said, "but a man's life is written on his heart." He tapped his own chest. "And this boy's life belongs with us." Silas let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You think these good people will accept that? You think this town will ever see you as anything other than outcasts?" He swept his arm out, gesturing to the crowd, challenging them, daring them to defy him. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind, rattling the rope on the flagpole. This was it, the moment of judgment. Then a voice piped up, thin but firm. It was old Mrs. Tully, the town's midwife. "That boy would have starved in that barn if it weren't for Miriam," she said, stepping forward. "And he would have burned to death last night if it weren't for Caleb. I don't know much about law, but I know this. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does." It was like a dam had broken. Another voice called out in agreement, then another. A chorus of murmurs rose from the crowd, a tide of public opinion turning against Silas. He watched, his face twisting with disbelief and rage, as he was left standing alone in a circle of silent condemnation. In a final desperate act, he did something unthinkable. He pulled a pistol from his belt, but Caleb was ready. In a movement too fast to follow, his own rifle was at his shoulder, steady and aimed. "Put it down, Silas." Caleb's voice was deadly calm. "You've lost. Don't lose your life, too." The square froze. Every breath was held. Silas stared down the barrel of the rifle, and in Caleb's cold, steady eyes, he finally saw the truth. This man would not back down. This man would die before he yielded. Slowly, with his shoulders slumping in defeat, Silas let the pistol fall from his hand, clattering on the dusty ground. The crowd let out a collective sigh, and then one by one, they began to turn their backs on him, a final, silent act of shunning. Miriam, who had been watching with her heart in her throat, finally let the tears come. They were tears of relief, of victory. Caleb swung Thomas up onto the horse's back, then lifted Miriam up to sit behind him. He mounted in front of them, his strong arm wrapping around them both, holding them secure. As the sun finally broke free of the morning clouds, spilling golden light across the square, the little boy looked up at the two people who had saved him. A small, timid smile touched his lips. "Mama," he whispered, looking at Miriam. Then he looked at Caleb. "Papa." The two words, so fragile and yet so powerful, sealed it. They were a family, born not of blood, but of fire and defiance and a love strong enough to face down a whole town. As they rode out of the square, leaving the disgraced Silas and the smoking ruins behind them, they were no longer outcasts. They were a testament to the fact that sometimes the family you choose is the only one that truly matters. Three broken souls, forged into one unbreakable bond. If you enjoyed this story and believe that courage can change the world, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the heart of the West. Let us know in the comments, if you had been in that town square, would you have spoken up for Thomas?